I'd like to talk in this video about interventions. Those bits of extra top-up that you do with children to try and close the gap which is there. So I'd like to start by talking about the code of practice and their assess, plan, do, review cycle that they say is needed as part of their graduated approach for when you are putting in interventions for a child. So, from the code of practice, where a setting makes special educational provision for a child with SEN, they should inform the parents. A maintained nursery school must inform the parents. All settings should adopt a graduated approach to the 4 stages of action: assess, plan, do, and review. And if you do these things really well in your school, you'll see colleagues coming to you and saying, this child couldn't do this, and now she can. It shouldn't be a surprise. Actually, your intervention should make an impact that takes people by surprise, that goes, they weren't doing this through their regular classroom teaching, but now, by having an additional intervention, actually, it's helping to close that gap. It may be a great way to break that fixed mindset around a child being at the bottom of the class, or being not able to do something, or being very weak with their vocabulary, and it should allow them to catch up. The issue, of course, may be timetabling and working out what do I take the child out of in order to place them within an intervention. Do I get them in early before school, or keep them back after school, or take them out of their lunch break? Or have them out of some maths lessons or PE lessons? All of those options are, of course, problematic. It's for you as the SENDCo to decide, well, where is it worth taking someone out of something in order to make it happen? We'll talk about each of these stages in turn, the first one being assess. The assessment process for intervention needs to be closely linked to your SEND identification and assessment processes anyway, and also to your academic data gathering. You might look at students who, in a speech and language screening, show a receptive language need. Therefore, you should put a group of other students with similar need. Or you may look at the Year 3s who aren't making sustained progress and aren't at the age-expected level of reading. Therefore, that becomes an intervention. So it's both your SEN assessment as well as the academic assessment processes at the school. With that intervention, what you want is objective and measurable data that can be gathered, or that has been gathered already before the intervention and can then be gathered again following the intervention. It's really important that you're creating your own evidence base around what works in your school. Don't overload one student into a lot of interventions that address the same thing. Partly from a sort of purist research point of view, you really only want one intervention targeting a particular area, for you to know whether it's making a difference or not, whether that's the thing that's making the difference. But also, you want to be having a bit of balance, not overwhelming a child with 10 different interventions. Actually, by staggering those across the year, by prioritising what do they need now in particular. Whereas, you don't want any students to have too many interventions at the same time. Of course, you want to make sure that there aren't students on your SEND register that you're ignoring. You want to be trying to get an overview of all the students on your SEN register and looking at who's in which intervention and really seeing where your gaps are. Are those gaps there because they don't need intervention? In which case, should they be in your SEN register? Or are those gaps there because you haven't put anything in place for them yet, and you'll have to make a note to yourself that you should? And in terms of what interventions you provide, I'll talk more in detail in future videos about this, but try to match your interventions to your students rather than having a fixed list of interventions that you match students to. It's very tempting, I think, for a SENDCo to have a list of this is what we do, irrespective of the children who walk through the door. It is best practice, really, to do that the other way round, to start with what the students' needs are and then resource, train your staff and plan what your offer is. Do it that way round. So that talks about the assessment, really. That leads into the planning. In terms of picking your interventions, you really should be looking at what interventions have a strong, objective, external evidence base. So a couple of places to find shortcuts for this, really. I can't recommend the Education Endowment Foundation highly enough. There's a graphic you may have seen where it talks about months of progress, positive months of progress and negative months of progress of particular interventions. There are many studies that are ongoing. You might have an intervention, you click on it, and actually they haven't had their report yet because they're doing a 3 or 4 year study into it. but there are dozens of reports in there about different approaches and different specific intervention packages. So you might look at a phonics-based approach to learning to read in the early years, and there's something around that as an approach. Then there are other things around specific intervention programs that might be bought. For example, I use Lexia in some of the schools I work in, and they're currently doing a 3 or 4 year study of using Lexia, for example. So when you're planning your intervention, you need to make sure it's led by someone with appropriate training. I have to caveat that by saying I almost never prioritize this. I sort of think we've got the program and I have faith in each member of staff, so it'll be okay. Maybe it is, maybe sometimes it is with the right professional support, but it really is something probably I ignore a bit too much. When you're planning, you need to plan in how you're going to notify and really consult parents about their child being within this intervention. The Code of Practice says that practitioners and the SENDCo should agree in consultation with the parent the outcomes that they are seeking, the intervention and support to be in place. So you really need to consult with parents and carers on this. Then you want to make sure that the intervention is being led the same way as the evidence suggests. If it says, or as close as possible within the restrictions of your timetable perhaps. So if it says this intervention needs to be done 3 times a week and you've booked in just to be done once a week, then that is going to be problematic. You want to make sure that your intervention is time limited. Normally I try to work around 8 to 10 weeks. Now of course, you can't have one rule for everyone. Students with a great level of need will need things over months and years. But I think the guiding principle is, if someone is in an intervention forever, then the intervention isn't closing the gap in the way you'd like to. So, just thinking, generally speaking, you'll try to time limit it with regular assessment points to work out, is this making the progress that I'd like it to? If it is, do I finish it? Or do I keep it going for a little bit longer, because the progress will keep increasing on this program? What do I change to a different intervention program? Then you, of course, need to make sure that you've resourced it, that you've bought into that program potentially, or at least taken the ethos of that approach and worked your own thing out. I'll talk a bit more in a moment about provision mapping, but when you're doing your planning, clearly some data needs to be put into whatever provision map you are using to make sure that there's a record of where the child is now. More about that in a moment. Then, of course, in your planning, you need to make sure that whoever's leading the intervention has the added professional support they need. So they could be going on a training course. It could be having a professional conversation with you about what you think is important for leading this intervention, or perhaps another colleague who's led the intervention previously. Perhaps even going to a neighbouring school and seeing the intervention in practice. You need to give that person adequate time, of course, to plan it and to resource it, to do the photocopying or read the manual or whatever is needed.